Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 45, Remastered. If you've been listening to the Biome playlist, you've journeyed with me as I've explored the oceans, the coastline, swamps and marshes, rivers and lakes and ponds. This has been a migratory journey, moving through marine biomes deeper inland to the more terrestrial biomes. Today's episode will complete this transition to dry land, as I'll be exploring some of the more arid and brutally terrestrial biomes on the planet. The main focus of this episode will be on the hot deserts, but I'll also be talking about savannas and grasslands. Alright, so I want to start by exploring the grasslands, which in some respects are pretty similar to marshes and other wetlands. The grasslands exist in some form or fashion on virtually every continent, with the exception of Antarctica. The grasslands are typically vast, wide expanses of flat land, and they're defined by this characteristic carpet of grasses, sedges, and rushes. And yet, despite their seeming simplicity, grasslands can be surprisingly diverse biomes, with anywhere from 20 to 40 different species of plant per square meter. And this doesn't even touch on the species diversity of insects, and birds, and rodents, and reptiles, and arachnids, and everything else. The wettest grasslands are those in the tropical regions of the world, which get flooded seasonally, or they get flooded by perpetual rains and tides that keep them flooded throughout most or all of the year. These flooded grasslands are really similar to the marshes that I discussed in the last episode. The herbaceous vegetation has to be hydrophilic, so as to withstand the regular flooding, but it also has to be durable, so that these plants can withstand the water stress that comes during the dry season. One of the larger flooded grasslands is the Pantanal in the heart of South America, which sits between the Chiquitano and arid Chaco dry forests on its western border and the humid Chaco forests to its south. Savanna borders the northern and eastern sides of the Pantanal, which becomes the rockier, higher altitude ground of southern Brazil. The Pantanal is a wide but relatively shallow basin that sits at the confluence of the Paraguay River and several of its tributaries. The land here is a lightly forested grassland, and during heavy rains, the river will swell and overwhelm its banks to flood the entire basin. The Pantanal can get up to 55 inches of rain a year, and during the heaviest parts of the rainy season, nearly 80% of the floodplains in this grassland basin can be flooded. The surface of the Paraguay River can rise anywhere from 2 to 5 meters, which is a huge surge that floods everything around it. This flooding leads to the deposition of sediment across the basin, which then leads to the gradual lifting of the basin floor as all of these sediment layers are perpetually deposited over and over and over again every flooding season. This sediment and nutrient-rich soil combined with regular water saturation creates an extremely fertile environment for plants. But the drier lands, the highlands that ring the Pantanal grasslands, are instead blanketed in dry forest trees. But in the deeper parts of the basin, the grassland dominates. There's more than 3,000 species of plants spread across the Pantanal grasslands, including a huge diversity of grasses, sedges, shrubs, and rushes. When the floodwaters come and they create this shallow sea in the basin, this watery area becomes home to hundreds of fish and amphibian species, which can thrive in this muddy, sediment-rich water with its persistently low oxygen content. In addition to all of these fish and amphibian, the Pantanal is also home to hundreds of reptile species, and thousands of invertebrate species, like various kinds of snails and a wide plethora of insects. All of these smaller species, squirming and crawling around everywhere, effectively turn this basin into a huge bowl of food for predatory species, including many of the hundreds and hundreds of species of birds that live here. Marsh deers, capybaras, and tapirs wade through the marshy, watery grassland, eating the herbaceous plants. Anteaters lick ants, worms, and termites up from the muddy ground. Birds like vultures, macaws, and the southern crested caracara fly overhead, while larger predators like the Pantanal jaguar hunt in the shadows. Now, I should clarify that I'm talking about dry and arid environments today, and so the Pantanal, being this seasonally flooded, humid grassland, is on an extreme end of the spectrum, with extremely high biodiversity, a complex ecology with keystone species and predatory regulators, and soil that's packed with nutrients and well hydrated from this regular flooding. But like I said, as far as grasslands and deserts are concerned, this kind of biome is on the extreme end of the spectrum, the extreme humid end. And as I go through this episode, we'll be moving along this spectrum to come to the drier, more arid end of the spectrum. And that's when we'll really dig into the deserts that I've named this episode for. Anyway, back at the other end of the spectrum, at the humid end of the spectrum, there's also tropical grasslands. The tropical grasslands are similarly humid, like the Los Llanos in the northern regions of South America. The Los Llanos is a wide, flat valley bordered by tall but gently sloping hills. Most of the floor of the Llanos Valley is grassland. From aerial images, it looks thick and verdant. Nearing the borders of the valley, near the hills and the highlands, stands of trees become more and more common, forming patches of forest that dot the grassland. These trees have tall trunks, with their lowest branches held quite high above the ground, and within their branches live all manner of tropical forest creatures, like insects, rodents, bats, and tropical birds. The wetlands can flood up to a meter during the summer wet season, which brings in dozens of species of waterfowl, like ducks, geese, and swan, as well as all manner of wading birds like the scarlet ibis. The scarlet ibis thrives in the wet grassland marshes during the wet season, with its bright red feathers making it stand out vividly against the greens and browns and blues of the landscape. The tropical grasslands and floodplains can support trees specifically because of their relative humidity, and more generally because of the warmer, more stable climates of the tropics. Trees can also exist in the savanna, which is a somewhat drier climate. The tree canopy in a savanna isn't closed, which means that branches of individual trees don't overlap. The canopy is open. Light can easily reach the ground because there isn't this overlap of all of these leafy branches. Compare this to a tropical rainforest, where the canopy is so dense that it blocks out almost all of the sunlight, even at high noon. If you find a dense enough jungle, you can walk through a forest in total darkness, when your watch says that it's noon or that it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the sun should be right overhead. But in the savanna, the open tree canopy enables a carpet of grasses and shrubs to grow on the ground, because they aren't being starved for light because of a thick canopy. And all of these grasses and shrubs on the ground are food for mammals like rodents and large grazers like goats and cows. Because water is often quite limited in the savanna, especially compared to tropical grasslands and tropical floodplains, the trees in a savanna have to compete with the grass for what little water exists in the soil. When grazing animals come through and eat up all the grass in a given area, they're actually lessening the pressure on trees to get water. They're helping the trees out, and this actually helps the trees to grow larger, because the grazing animals are effectively reducing the competition for water. But this grazing also lessens the pressure on weeds for the same reason, which is why spurts of weed growth and the thriving weed populations will often follow the trail of a grazing herd of animals. The Serengeti is a world-famous subtropical savanna located in Tanzania and Kenya, both countries on the eastern coasts of Africa. The Serengeti is a truly amazing place. It's considered to be one of the wonders of the natural world, and it's characterized by a high biodiversity that elegantly demonstrates ecological principles. The Serengeti has over 500 species of bird, and more than 100 species of mammal, 70 of which are large mammals that define the Serengeti. These charismatic megafauna include the herbivorous giraffe, wildebeest, gazelle, and zebra, and the carnivorous hyena, lion, and the various leopards. There have been extensive surveys and studies done on the wildlife populations in the Serengeti, and it's believed that there are more than 1,000 individual leopards, more than 3,000 individual lions, and more than 8,000 hyenas, which all prey on the hundreds of thousands of grazing mammals, like all of the zebra, topi, elands, and gazelle that wander the plains, and all of the water buffalo and cobus antelope that graze in the wetter areas near rivers, ponds, and lakes. At the beginning of the year, these grazing mammals in the Serengeti begin a huge migration, one of the world's largest migrations, actually. This happens shortly after the wet season, when the grass has been given a boost by the seasonal rainfall. More than 250,000 zebra, nearly 500,000 wildebeest, and almost 2 million gazelles migrate across the Serengeti from January to March, in what is an amazing, large-scale, animal-based refueling of the ecosystem. This might seem a little counterintuitive, because you're thinking that as these herds migrate across a landscape, surely they would just eat everything and desecrate the landscape. How could they refuel the ecosystem? Well, let me explain. So, these migrating herds give birth to hundreds of thousands of calves within the span of a month. Across the whole migratory period, hundreds of thousands of individuals will also die from thirst or hunger, or from the physical exhaustion of migrating over 500 miles. Many of them are killed by predation, by the packs and prides of the various carnivorans that live in the Serengeti. So in this sense, this reproducing and dying band of migrating herbivores are like a flood spreading nutritious sediment across a grassland. These migrations bring meat and nutrients deeper into the Serengeti. The lions and the leopards and the hyena are secondary and tertiary consumers, so they're quite high up the trophic food chain. It's why their populations tend to be so small compared to those of the herbivorous animals that they eat. So when all of these grazers come migrating in, they're literally saturating the ecosystem with chemical energy in the form of nutritious animal flesh. This surge of energy into the trophic chain can temporarily support larger predator populations, and so the predators gorge themselves. They mate and produce cubs, and the various carnivorans of all ages enjoy easy access to prey, and they eat until they get fat and lazy. Despite the carnivores doing as much hunting and killing and eating as they possibly can, the majority of the deaths that happen among these herbivores during their seasonal migrations actually occur through non-violent means. They die from hunger, thirst, or exhaustion somewhere along the migratory route, and their decomposing bodies, the hundreds and thousands of them, literally feeds the ground with nutrients. Their rotting corpses feed scavengers like vultures, and then a host of insects and bacteria. These rotting corpses will also leach nutrients into the soil, and this will feed local vegetation. So in this sense, the dead bodies of all of these migrating, grazing herbivores are a lot like the body of a whale in a whale fall. In a whale fall, the whale's body, its carcass, lands on the ocean floor, which is generally pretty barren and devoid of nutrients. And so the whale's body is like this hyper-concentrated node of nutrients and chemical energy, and it goes a long way to supporting the complex ecosystems that exist on the ocean floor. But here, on the dry land of the savanna, of the Serengeti, all of these dead bodies create smaller but more common nutrient nodes scattered across the landscape, and this feeds all manner of scavenging organisms. Now, in addition to all of this, in addition to the predators hunting and killing prey, and in addition to the herbivores dying and their rotting corpses feeding the soil and feeding all of the scavengers, you also have poop. Every living individual in all of these herds has to poop. They eat grass and they poop pretty much all day, and millions of them do this across an 800-kilometer expanse of land. Their waste carpets the ground, and it gets smashed and kneaded into the soil by the pounding hooves of thousands of other zebra, or gazelle, or water buffalo, or what have you. All of this decomposing biomass, from the dead corpses to the poop, thoroughly enriches the soil, and promotes the growth of trees and more grasses for next year's migrations. Now, I should clarify that most grasslands aren't as humid as floodplains and tropical grasslands. Temperate grasslands tend to be significantly drier, and they have a lot less trees than a tropical grassland or a savanna. The temperate grasslands typically have just grass and shrubs. There's almost no trees at all. The Great Plains that run down the center of North America, the prairies as it's known in Canada, and just the prairie in the US, is one such temperate grassland. These grassland plains are quite plain. They are absurdly flat, to the point where the ground meets the sky in a flat horizon in every direction that you look. It's almost like being out on the open sea, except instead of water, it's grass, and more grass, and grass as far as the eye can see. This flat ground is almost exclusively carpeted in grasses and shrubs, with no tree in sight. For a human, this landscape might seem a little boring. Visually, it's one of the least stimulating landscapes that you can experience. But for a huge range of other large mammals, the temperate grasslands are literally an endless field of food. Imagine walking through a field that's covered from horizon to horizon with sandwiches. Everywhere you go, you're walking on a thick layer of warm, delicious sandwiches. You can reach down and grab one and eat as much as you want, and if you're done, you can throw it away and it'll decompose and grow more sandwiches. For a cow, or a muskox, or some other large grazing mammal, this is what the grassland is like. This is their sandwich-covered landscape. That's how all grazing mammals see the grassland. They just see food everywhere. Zebra and rhinoceros graze on the grasslands of the Central African plains. Bison, horses, and cattle graze in the heart of North America. And other horses run across the montane grasslands and the steppe of Central Asia. Smaller mammals, like mice and prairie dogs, will burrow through the soft ground, while larger animals like snakes, rabbits, badgers, and skunks will sneak through the grass hunting predators. Or in the case of rabbits and skunks and other herbivores, they're hunting vegetation. Although you don't really hunt vegetation, you just walk around and find it and eat it. Anyway, predatory birds like owls and hawks will fly overhead, with a perfect vantage point that's completely uninterrupted by the branches of any tree. These owls and hawks will prey on the mice and the rabbits and the prairie dogs of the temperate grasslands, just like the snakes, hyenas, and coyotes do. These three herbivores, the mice, the rabbits, and the prairie dogs, are the primary consumers that form the base of the grassland animal food chain. They feed off of the dense ground-level vegetation, and they reproduce rapidly, filling entire fields with offspring in the time that it takes larger mammals to gestate and birth a single calf. Thus, these smaller mammals perpetuate a fuzzy, fleshy layer that intermingles with the grass, and offers a constant food source for all manner of flying, prowling, or slithering predators. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned the montane grasslands. These montane grasslands are high-altitude flatland that exists along steppes and mountain ranges. This montane is exclusive to highlands, and it also lacks trees almost everywhere, except for those near the occasional river or lake. In addition to the general aridity of lowland temperate grasslands, the montane also has the low oxygen content and the greater radiation exposure that is part and parcel with life at higher elevation, and on average, there's a much lower temperature due to a lessened greenhouse effect. All of these factors, from lower oxygen content to lower temperature to greater radiation exposure to lower humidity, all of these things combine to discourage the growth of anything larger than tall grass or a small shrub. As a result, these ecosystems in the montane grasslands tend to be relatively simple. They're not very complex because the geography and the climate just can't support a complex, dense, developed ecology. It can't support this complex biota. Because of this, these drier, cooler, high-altitude montane grasslands are a lot like the tundra, but I'll talk about the tundra in more detail in the next episode. Now you might be noticing that I'm moving through drier and drier grasslands. I'm moving across this spectrum, away from the humid floodplains and tropical grasslands to the xeric grasslands and shrublands at the other end of the spectrum. Instead of regular flooding and humid wind, these regions on the drier end of the spectrum get precious little rain, and so they have dry air virtually year-round. Where species of amphibians dominate the wetlands and the floodplains and the tropical grasslands of the world, the amphibians, by and large, can't handle the heat and aridity of the xeric grasslands and the deserts. As a result, the amphibians tend to be replaced by the reptiles, which can handle the dry air and the brutal heat and the light of a desert sun. Very few amphibian species can persist in these dry biomes, but they're relatively rare, and they've evolved unique means of survival in their unforgiving habitat. These xeric grasslands and shrublands are inhabited by hundreds of species of shrubs, ferns, and flowering plants that dot the otherwise barren soil. These plants have managed to adapt, to evolve, to fit into this rugged landscape and tolerate the present conditions. One of the most damning variables of the xeric landscape, besides the general lack of water, is the nutrient-poor soil. When there's too little water and too much heat, it can be hard for plants to grow. When it's hard for plants to grow, it's hard for animals like rodents, insects, birds, and amphibians and reptiles to stick around in large numbers. Life begets life. Life makes the environment more habitable for other life. But in the xeric shrubland, there isn't a whole lot of room for life in the first place. In the open desert, there's less water and even less life. The deserts are areas of the planet that are so devoid of water that the subsequent geochemical processes create vast sand dunes and wasteland expanses of crumbling rock. With little to no water in the atmosphere, there's nothing to absorb the heat of the sun, so during the day it can get extremely hot because the sun is breathing right on the ground, but during the night it can get extremely cold, and this is because there's no moisture in the air to hold onto the heat that's been accumulated during the day, and so when the sun sets, when the source of heat goes away, all of the heat in the atmosphere radiates away very quickly, and so the nighttime in a desert can become very cold, to the point where cactus can be covered in frost. The lack of vegetation also means that winds are able to sweep across the surface at full force, which carries sand and sediment and crashes it into larger rocks, which erodes them. The wind and the intense temperature differences between day and night contribute to the dry erosion of the landscape, which is why so many deserts are composed of sand plains or sand dunes, exposed bedrock, or expanses called desert pavements, where all of the fine particles have been blown away, only to leave behind a patterned landscape of bare rock. Because of these and similar factors, the layer of nutritious soil in a xeric and desert biome is typically really thin. In higher latitude regions with tundra and boreal forest, this soil layer is really thick because the cold temperatures prevent stuff from decaying quickly, so all of the dead plant and animal matter tends to build up and accumulate. In the jungles and the tropical rainforest near the equator, the soil layer might be surprisingly thin, because despite the dense flora and fauna dying all the time, all of the dead things tend to decay really quickly, and their nutrients get absorbed by other organisms. Due to the temperature, humidity, and the diversity of decomposing and scavenging species, there simply isn't enough time for detritus in a tropical jungle to accumulate and create a thick soil layer. In the xeric grasslands and the xeric shrublands, there isn't enough growth in the first place to produce a decently thick layer of soil. There just isn't enough life to die and decompose and produce the soft soil that other life can feed off of. Life begets life, and here we see an example of where a lack of life can limit life. But the entire grassland or shrubland isn't all dry and lifeless. Where you see an oasis or a river that cuts through the xeric and desert biomes, you'll see the genesis of a riparian corridor, which is thick with trees and ferns and flowers and grasses and all manner of other plants. This is because the soil near the river or the oasis is well hydrated, and it can support an extremely dense community of flora relative to the open grassland or the open desert. Don't be mistaken though. Even the dry, rugged, xeric grassland can support a decently biodiverse range of organisms, from animals like reptiles and mammals to various heat-tolerant plants. Within this drier xeric biome, native animals are called xericoles, and native plants are called xerophytes. So you still have a pretty respectable amount of biodiversity even in the drier biomes. But when you're looking at these wetter areas within the dry biomes, like the oasis, or the riparian corridor running alongside a river, the biodiversity just explodes because the water and the nutrients and all of the other life there begets more life. If you've read the book Dune by Frank Herbert, which is a total favorite of mine, I love that book. If you've read Dune, you might recall how the Fremen are forced to live on their brutally dry desert world, Arrakis. Water on Arrakis is an extremely scarce resource, to the point that the Fremen's entire society is built around the capture and the preservation of water. Water is so rare and so valued that not only do they recycle their urine and feces to extract as much water as they can, they even drain the bodies of their dead so as to retrieve as much water as possible for the living members of their tribes. It's an extremely hardcore utilitarian adaptation to life in an extremely dry environment. Obviously, the Earth is not nearly as dry as the fictional planet of Arrakis, but some regions of the Earth are very arid, much more arid than others. These areas include the cold deserts, like Antarctica, and the vast expanses of tundra that sit north of the boreal forests, and they also include the xeric grasslands, and obviously the hot deserts. The xericoles and the xerophytes that live in these habitats have had to evolve their own adaptations for life in the brutally dry conditions, which gives them all really distinct morphologies and physiologies. For example, the xerophytic plants are under tremendous evolutionary pressure to conserve as much water as possible, and to use what little water they have as efficiently as possible. The biggest loss of water for typical plants, by far, occurs through transpiration. The roots will extract water out of the ground, and this water is then pulled up the stem to the leaves, where it evaporates away in the dry air. This evaporation of water off of the thin, delicate leaf tissue creates a pressure difference, and it's this delta P that pulls up more water from the roots. You know how when you take a napkin and you put the corner of it in a glass of water, the water will diffuse up the napkin a little bit? It gets more of the napkin wet than was actually dipped in the water. This is simple diffusion, as the water spreads through the otherwise dry napkin from its initial point of contact. The plants work kind of like this too. The roots are like the part that's actually dipped in the water, because the roots are permanently positioned in the wet ground. But the leaves are high up in the air, and they're constantly being dried out by the wind. When the top is dry and the bottom is wet, the moisture near the ground is naturally drawn upwards, but just like with the napkin example, the water can only get so far up. Vascular plants have evolved vertical tubes and pipes to facilitate this upward flow of water, and this creates an internal pressure called turgor pressure. When an herbaceous plant is well hydrated, the stem and its branches are filled with water, and transpiration is going on like normal. The internal pipes are all filled with flowing water, and there exists a dynamic but steady turgor pressure that keeps the plant's leaves and branches stiff and upright. This is also why a dehydrated plant that has low turgor pressure will appear limp and droopy. Alright, so to tie this back into deserts and xeric grasslands, the xerophyte plants want to slow down this process of transpiration as much as possible. Rapid, perpetual transpiration implies that the plant is moving huge quantities of water up through its body. For most plants, this is a healthy and normal part of regular life, But for a plant that lives in the desert, this can be dangerous. A plant in the desert needs to preserve as much water as possible, because there just isn't that much water available in the first place. And so, if one of these plants was to experience heavy transpiration, where water was being rapidly pulled through its body and released back into the air, this heavy transpiration can be a death sentence, because it can quickly use up all of the water that the plant has available. The adaptations that were evolved to protect against this water loss range from the microscopic and the cellular to the macroscopic organization of the plant's body parts. Perhaps the most fundamental evolved trait of these xerophytes is a reduction in their external surface area. If you look at a plant in a tropical rainforest, they often have lots of huge leaves, but if you look at a plant in a xeric grassland or a desert, they tend to have small leaves, very few leaves, or often no leaves at all. This is most evident when you look at cactus, whose leaves have been wrapped up into thin little thorns and spikes, and their cylindrical body structure presents a total surface area that's orders of magnitude smaller than a similarly sized plant with lots of leaves. This drastic reduction in surface area minimizes the amount of water that can be lost through transpiration. This is a really fundamental example of the integration of form and function in a biological system. Plants have evolved a form with smaller surface area so as to preserve the function of retaining their water and using their water more efficiently. Now, the plants also have little pores, called stomata, that have to be open at least some of the time so that carbon dioxide can come in and oxygen can go out. This is a critical aspect of photosynthesis. If their stomata are closed, then there's no gas exchange, and if there's no gas exchange, then plants can't perform photosynthesis. They can't grow, and they can't produce carbon compounds. But these open stomata that lets in the carbon dioxide to produce all the sugars and fuel photosynthesis, these open stomata will also simultaneously let water evaporate out of the plant. In response to this, xerophytes tend to only open their stomata at night. It's cooler and darker at night, so the rate of evaporation is much slower, and the plant can afford to have its stomata open. But during the day, in an open desert, the stomata pretty much have to be closed, otherwise the plant will simply leak out too much water. The rate of evaporation will be way too high. Another way to slow down transpiration is the evolution of little hairs, or thorns, that operate kind of like a miniature forest along the surface of the plant, that break up the wind and create a humid little microclimate in the thin layer of air that's immediately surrounding the plant. This humid microclimate lessens the difference in water potential between the inside and the outside of the plant, and this will slow transpiration, just like how a river flows slower on flat ground than it does on a hillside. The difference between inside and outside, or high ground and low ground, is reduced, and thus the rate of water flow between them is also reduced. The xerophytes will also produce thick cuticles, or external layers of a secreted, waxy substance that creates a waterproof seal. The cuticle can obviously help seal in water, but by that very same token, it will also seal in gases and so prevents gas exchange. Plants have to create this waxy cuticle layer in a way that offers some protection from water loss, but doesn't end up cutting off gas exchange and strangling the plant like a person with their head sealed in saran wrap. Some xerophytes are called succulents because they try to preserve as much water as possible within their tissues, and this leads to the tissue looking swollen. The leaves, the stems, the roots, or the tubers of a succulent plant may look thick and fleshy, swollen, or bulbous, and when you cut them open, the inside of the plant is really wet and juicy because of all of the stored up water, which gives them the name succulents. These xerophytic succulent plants are like huge water capsules that dot an otherwise dry and barren landscape. These xerophytes also engage in a specialized kind of water-efficient photosynthesis called crassulation acid metabolism. And I know that sounds pretty intense, but don't worry, I'm not going to talk about it that much today. I'll talk about crassulation acid metabolism in much more detail in a future episode that will focus exclusively on photosynthesis. Alright, so those are the desert plants, but what about the desert animals? The animals that live in deserts and the xeric grasslands are called xericoles, and just like their xerophyte counterparts, they've had to evolve and adapt to fit into their punishingly hot and brutally dry habitat. Just like the plants, the desert animals' top priorities are conserving water and staying cool. What's really fascinating is that, just like the cuticles produced by the plants to seal in moisture, desert animals, from insects to birds to mammals, have evolved to secrete an oily layer that serves the exact same purpose. This thin layer of oil secreted onto the exterior of their skin is kind of like a watertight seal that helps to minimize water loss through sweating. What's even more fascinating is that several species of desert insect secrete particular wax molecules that actually rearrange when it gets too hot, and this rearrangement will then allow for evaporation. So it's kind of like a temperature-activated cooling apparatus. Much like sweating, this evaporation will cool the insect, but it only activates when it's really hot, like 30 degrees Celsius or hotter, as a kind of emergency cooling mechanism. Most desert mammals and birds have also evolved a suppressed sweat response, as sweating wastes water, so they've adapted other ways to cool themselves off. Many of these creatures rely on panting, which still loses water through the mouth, but overall, panting through the mouth loses much less water than would be lost through full-body sweating. Other animals will spread liquid over their bodies to cool off, like tortoises that drool on their neck and legs, or rodents that dampen their legs and fur via licking. Some species of bird will even urinate on their legs as a way to cool down. These particular methods of cooling down are kind of primitive. I mean, the animals are literally just drooling on themselves or peeing on themselves to cool off. But there's been a more ingenious way that was evolved to preserve water, and this involves the concentration of urea in the urine. In all animals, the nitrogenous waste products of digestion are broken down into urea and diluted in water so as to be easily flushed out of the body. But when you're in a desert and every ounce of water counts, you can't afford to dilute your urea with too much water. You can't afford to just piss out all of this water. There's an evolutionary pressure here, and this evolutionary pressure has forged major alterations to xericole kidneys. Their nephrons are longer, the glomeruli are fewer in number, and the glomerular filtration rate is greatly reduced. In less technical terms, what this means is that less water is extracted from the blood to dilute the urea, and so the urine comes out relatively dry. Some animals don't dilute with water at all, and they just excrete their urine waste as raw uric acid. Feces is also pretty water-heavy in most animals, but xericoles have evolved to produce fecal waste that's extremely dry, if not entirely dry. Because the deserts are so hot and punishingly dry, there's very few amphibians that can live there. However, the few amphibians that do live in deserts and xeric grasslands are generally the hardier species of toad and frog. These toads and frogs have permeable skin, and they really depend on moisture, so life in the desert environment has required an extreme solution. These xericole frogs and toads can store a lot more nitrogen than other frogs, which effectively means they urinate far less often. Some frogs have external glands that secrete lipid molecules, and the frogs can literally wipe these glands with their forelimbs, like their hands, to smear the lipids all over their bodies. This is kind of like a built-in form of sunscreen. Almost. It's really weird. I mean, they basically have these soft glands that secrete sunscreen, and they just wipe it all over themselves. Other frogs do even crazier stuff, like burrowing underground at the height of the dry season, and partially shedding their skin. Layer after layer of skin will get partially shed, until the burrowed frog has wrapped itself in a cocoon-like suit of its own layers of flesh. This literal skin cocoon, or skin suit, is generally impermeable to water, which will then help the frog preserve the water in its body. This gnarly technique is almost like an imitation of the thick scales and skin of the amphibian's reptile cousins. During the wet season, or I suppose if we're talking about deserts and xeric grasslands, I should call it the wetter season because it's really not that wet. During the wetter seasons, the frogs fully shed their skin and start over. Some other adaptive strategies to live in the desert involve burrowing to keep cool, or some animals will compulsively seek out shade and shelter under rocks, or in crevices, or behind a cactus or a dense bush. The animals like fennec foxes and various rabbits have really large ears that are permeated with a dense vasculature. When they get too hot, the veins in the ears can dilate so that more blood flows through them, and this way they can cool off. There's more blood running through this thin ear tissue, which is exposed to the cooler air, and this will pull heat out of the animal's body, literally pulling the heat out of their blood. Interestingly, a lot of mammals have thinner coats of fur, and birds have less extensive feather coverage, especially on their undersides. Many xerical mammals have what are called thermal windows, or patches in their fur that are sparse or so thin to the point where the animal is almost naked at that patch. These thermal windows include the groin, the chest, and the armpits, as these areas are often highly vascularized and relatively warm compared to other parts of the body. The naked skin in this thermal window is easily cooled because there's no fur or feathers there to retain the heat, and this in turn helps to cool down the animal. The birds have similar patches on their bellies and hips and on the undersides of their wings, and a common cooling technique for the birds is to lift their wings and to hold their wings up in the air to expose that naked skin to the air so that they can cool off. So if you're in the desert and you see a bird holding its wings up, it's not ill, it's not injured, it's just trying to cool off. These evolutionary pressures to cool yourself off and to retain water are the defining characteristics for all life that lives in these hot, arid desert biomes. And with that, I think we have come to the end of the episode. I really wanted to go on longer about all of the cool adaptations and features that desert animals have, because there's so much cool stuff there to talk about. But because there's so much cool stuff to talk about, this episode would have dragged on for over an hour. And as fun as that might sound, I'm trying to keep these episodes brief. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something cool or fascinating or exciting about the grasslands, the savanna, and the desert. And I hope I was able to stimulate your mind to think about these biomes in a new way. If you like this episode, hit the like button. If you like all my content, hit the subscribe button so that you can see new episodes right when I post them. And if you want to support the podcast in other ways, consider buying something in the official store or supporting us on Patreon. Every bit of support that you want to give the podcast is greatly appreciated because it keeps this whole project going. And as always, thanks for listening.